out. Everybody.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Lights Out. I'm your host, Ja.
And I'm your host, Austin.
And I'm the producer, Daniel.
And today we are taking a look at a case that is deeply disturbing and one that I'm honestly surprised that most people don't know about.
Yeah, it's a low-key serial killer case that's like really disturbing.
I was talking to one of my buddies this weekend, and he is pretty in the know when it comes to serial killers and true crime and consumes a lot of that content. And I mentioned to him that we're recording this episode on the Foxhole Farm murders and Herb Baumeister, and he was like, "What?
Who?
Never heard of him before."
Mm-hmm.
And I think you'll see why this one has gone under the radar for so long. But this guy, Herb Baumeister, is probably one of the most prominent serial killers that no one has ever heard of. He's responsible for the deaths of at least 20 plus.
Yeah, they estimate at least 25 victims.
And according to one individual named Mark Goodyear, that we'll talk about quite a bit in this episode, he's put out there 50 plus, which is insane and
wild.
The other aspect of this case that makes it just so deeply disturbing is the fact that Foxhole Farm has been the resting place for, countless victims, but they have uncovered 10,000 human remains, bone fragments essentially, on this property over the past 30 years. And there's also a good chance that you maybe, if you've been on Hulu recently, in the last week or so, a new docuseries just was released that is very, very well done.
It's so good,
in my opinion, and has really sparked renewed interest in this case. And maybe you've been following some of the headlines in true crime, but there is a renewed focus in trying to identify these victims of Herb Baumeister, largely in part thanks to this new docuseries called The Foxhole Murders: Playground of a Serial Killer. I found this docuseries to be very well done, and it features Jeff Jellison, who is the coroner in Hamilton County, which is where Foxhole Farm is. And it was really refreshing to see a coroner
care.
Yeah. Care.
Mm-hmm.
That's honestly, you put the words right in my mouth. Care about these victims. And the police at the time just absolutely dropped the ball because, as far as we know, a good majority of these victims were gay men.
Yeah.
And, going back to the early 90s, society just, and especially in Hamilton County, the view of the gay community was not good.
Yeah.
And just people and the authorities just looked at them as less than, which is extremely sad. But I'm glad that after all these years, there is this renewed focus. And there's also some new questions being presented. Did Herb Baumeister have an accomplice? Did somebody help him with disposing of all these bodies? Because if you think about it, you're talking about 20 plus individuals whose remains are on this property and scattered into a million pieces. It seems incredibly difficult for one person, especially as we dive into who Herb was and some of the details around his background. It's very hard to wrap your mind around how this one guy lured these men back to his house, murdered them, and then disposed of their remains at this magnitude. It's just, it's mind-boggling. So there's it's something to kind of keep in mind as we go through this case, but probably one of the most insane cases I've ever covered or looked into. I mean, it is extremely important that the word gets out there because they are trying to identify these remains, and they need DNA samples from family members who potentially have, a lost loved one that may have been associated with Herb Baumeister at some point, to provide that DNA sample so that when they start doing the testing, that they can hopefully make that identification finally.
Yep.
So this is buckle up. This one is just wild. I mean, I don't know that we've ever covered somebody quite like Herb. So let's just get into it here. So this case begins in the early 1990s in Indianapolis, Indiana, in a commuter town just to the north, Carmel, in Hamilton County. Now, Hamilton County was and still is very much a deep red county, and the city of Indianapolis was much different in the 90s compared to what it is today. It was a much more conservative city back then. There was virtually no nightlife, and the downtown was basically empty after 5 o'clock except for a small string of gay nightclubs. And these remained underground for the most part so that they could act as a safe haven for gay men in a region surrounded by communities that didn't accept them. Our place, now called Greg's, was one of those nightclubs. It started as a one-room bar and quickly grew as it became popular in the gay community. And on any given night, the dance floor would be packed and the patrons came from all different walks of life. And really, it didn't take long before our place was one of the most mainstream gay bars in the entire city. Bars like this became the center of the gay community in Indianapolis. Meanwhile, many of the conservative locals were upset about this community growing in Indianapolis. In the 80s, local police officers would arrest gay and lesbian groups for loitering or prostitution, and in many cases, this was targeted harassment by the police. Carrie Milligan, a former detective for the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, acknowledged that many within the gay community didn't trust the police, and rightfully so. They're being harassed. And since it became obvious the LGBTQ+ crowd wasn't welcome in public, the gay bars became the only places in the city where they felt safe. And just so you understand, like, we obviously know the correct term, for gay community now is just LGBTQ+ community. Mm-hmm. But for the sake of the episode and also the victims were gay men, and just to simplify things, that's why we're saying gay community, gay men.
Yeah. Gay bars.
Bars, just to keep it simple. And
don't kill us. Don't murder us.
Yeah. Don't come for us. So if we go back to the late 80s, mid 90s, the AIDS crisis had swept through Indianapolis, and it was so dire that some even lost entire friend groups to HIV and AIDS. Sometimes gay men would become sick and disappear after a few weeks, and many assumed these men had lost the battle to HIV and AIDS. And by the summer of 1993, it was common for patrons of these gay bars to never be seen again. So when men started to go missing in the area, it took a while for anyone to catch on that these men weren't dying from HIV, that they were in fact being abducted. Missing persons posters soon started showing up inside gay bars around town.
So in 1993, David Allender from the Missing Persons Unit of the Indianapolis Police Department contacted a homicide investigator who handled abductions in the area. That investigator claimed they had several missing persons reports on file, but none of them were technically abduction cases, and they figured anyone who had gone missing had simply, we've heard this a million times, run away, and they would eventually return. Others figured the missing men had died of HIV, like we were saying. One of the men who went missing was Alan Livingston, and Alan was described as loving, caring, and he had a great sense of humor. He had been spotted getting into a vehicle in downtown Indianapolis in August of 1993, and he was never seen again. His mother, Sharon, immediately knew something was wrong when he didn't call, since he would basically call every single weekend, so she then contacted local police and filed a missing persons report. Police told her she would hear from them within the next few months, but they never contacted her. Alan's case was quickly forgotten about. His family suspected that his case was pushed aside because he was a gay man.
Which I think we can all agree was a pretty accurate suspicion.
Yeah. Once you see this case in full as well, there's just no denying that was a huge factor in this. The same year, several more men had gone missing, and these were Johnny Bayer, Jeffrey Allen Jones, Richard Douglas Hamilton Jr., Manuel Resendez, and in 1994, 3 more men went missing: Stephen Sperlin Hale, Alan Broussard, and Roger Allen Goodlet. And in 1995, Michael Frederick Kieran and Jerry Williams Comer also went missing. So Mary Wilson was a missing persons detective at the time, and for years, many had seen the missing persons in Indianapolis as kind of just individual situations of people disappearing, but she was actually one of the first to see a connected pattern for some of these men and their stories. Each of the previously mentioned men were all about the same age, all about the same size, and many had become estranged from their families because they were gay. Most of them were also last seen in or near gay bars concentrated in an area of the city that was about 2 square miles. So soon it became public knowledge that gay bars were possibly being targeted. And some of these establishments began posting warning signs and making announcements saying things like, hey, if you're going to leave with someone tonight that you just met, make sure to notify your friends, let them know who you're leaving with and where you're going. Another problem was that since many of these men were estranged from their families, there was sometimes no one to report them missing. And even if they were reported missing, police just suspected, like we said, they just ran away and maybe they would eventually return. So it took years of missing persons reports until police finally began taking these disappearances more seriously. Even law enforcement in Hamilton County today acknowledges that these missing men were not a priority at the time. They did not fit the heteronormative conventions of the deeply conservative community of Hamilton County, and these negative attitudes towards the gay community would really deeply affect this original investigation. And since the gay community's relationship with local police had been so strained for years, many people within that community did not want to speak with police.
Which unfortunately creates this perfect storm.
Yeah.
And creates an environment where a predator can operate with, and clearly somebody who understands, this dynamic,
right,
knows that the likelihood of being caught or somebody reporting someone missing after they've been abducted is very low.
Right.
So they took advantage of this time period. With the help of a private investigator, Virgil Vandegrift, a promising lead was uncovered. And we actually have a clip. This is from 2023, so he was obviously much younger when he was investigating this. But
I think he has since passed, actually.
Oh, really?
Like a year ago or something.
But we just want to show you this short little clip. Let Virgil explain what he did.
Because for you, it went from a simple missing persons case,
right,
to a serial killer.
Correct.
The retired Marion County Sheriff's detective worked a lot of high-profile crimes.
The Speedway bombings.
But as a private investigator in the 90s, Vandegrift began the Baumeister case. He got calls from 2 separate families of missing men, both gay, similar physically, who disappeared from local bar.
I knew it was important to get the missing flyers out, number one, and to establish communications with people in the gay community. And it didn't take long to find out that there were a lot of missing people.
Close to a dozen missing gay men. But the PI hit roadblocks with police reluctant to investigate. So Vandegrift developed a profile of the killer.
A white male in his late 30s, early 40s, married with family.
I just want to say good on Virgil for, taking it upon himself to investigate these disappearances when police were clearly not interested, and is really a hero in this case, because I don't know that we would have ever figured out who Herb was had he not, taken it upon himself to start investigating these disappearances. But his investigation ultimately led him to a man named Mark Goodyear. As I mentioned at the beginning, he is we don't really know how big of a player he is in this case, but he's certainly involved in some way. Some reports identified this man as Tony Harris, which might have been an alias used by Mark Goodyear at the time of the police interview. So this guy's named, and police bring him in for an interview at the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office on June 26, 1996. And what follows in this interrogation is all according to Mark's original statement. So this is some snippets of his statement here. He claimed that sometime in 1994, he had met a guy named Brian Smart at a gay bar in downtown Indianapolis. Brian had convinced Mark to come back to his home somewhere in Hamilton County for a nightcap. Once there, they headed down to his basement, where there was a bar and pool area. Mark claimed that he saw mannequins surrounding the pool. They had been set up in odd positions and even behind the bar. Some were dressed in clothing like they were at a club. So just imagine this for a moment. This is very odd, very creepy. And I'm sure Mark was like, okay, this is very strange. But Brian then offered Mark a cocktail, but he felt uneasy. He was immediately creeped out by all the mannequins, and he felt like he shouldn't take the drink. So he headed to the bathroom with the cocktail and dumped it out into the sink. He then rinsed the glass and filled it with water before he returned. The men then proceeded to have consensual sex and participated in erotic asphyxiation. In other words, air is deprived until the person reaches a euphoric state just before going unconscious, typically for sexual gratification. In the shallow end of the pool, Mark then choked Brian with a small hose as Brian masturbated. In Mark's own words, he said, quote, "His eyes were bugging out, lips are turning purple, the whole 9 yards. He's into it." Then Brian got out of the pool and approached Mark from behind. He then placed a hose around Mark's neck. Mark faked passing out because he felt pressured to participate. He then put a stop to it. He spent the rest of the night at Brian's house, and he could sense that there was just something off about Brian. He had a clear fascination with strangulation since he insisted on choking Mark. Once Mark returned home the next day, he felt that if he had been any more drunk, Brian would have tried to choke him and take advantage of him. Mark suspected that Brian had probably attempted to do this with other men before. He even suspected Brian of strangling others to death. Mark said, quote, "I know he's off some people. I know for a fact he has." Unfortunately, after the interview, Mark could not lead police back to the house in Hamilton County that he had visited on the night in question. Investigator Mary Wilson attempted at least 3 times to find the location but failed. But at least with Mark's statement, the investigation had a small foundation to move forward with. Their next move was to find Brian Smart. Who is this guy? After the interview, many local law enforcement feared that they had a serial killer on their hands. At the time, Hamilton County had very rich residents. It's a very affluent area. Murder rates were typically very low, so to have a serial killer on the loose took everyone by surprise. And if the man Mark had encountered was the killer, they assumed he probably wouldn't have used his real name. Luckily, Mark Goodyear warned others in the community about the individual he had encountered that night. He also gave them the man's description. Reportedly, one of his friends recognized the man, known as Brian Smart, and took down his license plate number. Investigator Mary Wilson ran the plate numbers and discovered that they actually belonged to a man named Herbert Baumeister, aka Brian Smart. At this particular time, police had no idea who this guy was. He doesn't have a criminal record. He's just not in their consciousness at all. So kind of came as a surprise, like, what? This guy?
This guy, local business owner? Odd.
This episode is brought to you by Rocket Money, one of my favorite apps. It is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It monitors your spending and helps you lower your bills so you can grow your savings, because it's the new year. It's time to rocket those savings to the next level. With Rocket Money, you can have all of your accounts all connected in one place. It really makes it easy to manage all of your personal finances. I use it every single day. When I hit the toilet first thing in the morning, I'm popping open Rocket Money.
Nice. That's a good morning routine.
Yeah, it is. You spend money almost every day, it seems like. So you can just keep track of, what you've been spending, take a look at the upcoming bills that are coming into your account, direct deposits, all that kind of good stuff. But it's also great at finding those subscriptions that you've forgotten about, because we all have them. And if you haven't used Rocket Money yet to locate them, you're probably missing out on a bunch of savings. Because when I got my accounts connected to Rocket Money, I discovered all sorts of subscriptions from years ago that I was still paying for that I thought I had canceled. Turns out I didn't. I found a gym membership that I hadn't been to in like 3 years that I was paying $10 a month for. And I was like, what the hell is this?
Ridiculous.
It's like, I moved 3 years ago and I'm still paying for the gym by my old house. What is going on here?
Oof.
So it just helps you, nail those down, get them canceled. Plus, what's really cool about Rocket Money is you can upload a picture of your bill, and then they'll go out and try to negotiate a lower rate for you, whether that's a utility bill, your internet bill, TV bill, whatever it may be. Give Rocket Money the chance to go and find you some more savings. It's a great feature that I haven't seen anywhere else. And yeah, you can save a bunch of money. Rocket Money has over 5 million users, including us, and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when you use all the app's premium features, which the premium features are well worth the couple bucks it costs per month. And credit monitoring, net worth tracking, you can set up all these types of custom alerts and spending and budgets, and you name it, Rocket Money can do it.
So cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lightsout today. That's rocketmoney.com/lightsout. rocketmoney.com/lights out. So 49-year-old Herbert, or he goes by Herb, lived at a property called Fox Hollow Farm in Carmel, Hamilton County, Indiana, with his wife Juliana, who went by Julie, and their 3 children. They had bought the property in 1988. I mean, this is a massive home, 4 bedrooms, 2 libraries, a 5-car garage, and an indoor pool with a bar. I mean, honestly, just an absolutely beautiful home. Julie called it their utopia, and it's this beautiful 11,000 square foot English Tudor style home is surrounded by an 18-acre wooded area and a creek on the west border.
So sprawling property.
Yeah,
Massive
huge.
house, tons of land.
Yeah. From the outside, Herb was seen as a great father, and their family seemed very ordinary. They were churchgoers and very family-oriented, but those who knew them a bit more personally could tell that something was a little off with Herb. Herb had come from a family of 4 children, and Julie described his upbringing as happy, and that he grew up in a beaver-cleaver kind of home. His father was a respected anesthesiologist, and his mother was a socialite. His good grades got him into Indiana University in 1965, but he dropped out after only a semester. He returned later in 1967, which is when he met his future wife, Julie, but he dropped out again. He later attended Butler University, and I don't think he ever graduated, but I couldn't find that out. According to those who knew him, Herb's behavior was very odd, beginning in his teenage years especially. He was reportedly a loner and never dated. A friend from that era alleged that Herb had once wondered out loud what human urine tasted like and had apparently developed a sexual fascination with urine early on. Another story alleged he once picked up a dead crow, brought it to school, and left it on a teacher's desk. And at one point, he also co-owned a hearse with a friend. He was so weird that he eventually got the nicknames Weird Herb and Herbert the Pervert. Apparently, his father was aware of his odd behavior and had taken him in for psychological testing when he was young. He was allegedly diagnosed with schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder, but his treatment after this is unclear. Obviously, I mean, I don't know how do you get those records, but that's just alleged as far as we know. When he was 24 in 1971, only 6 months after he had married Julie, he spent about 50 days in a psychiatric hospital, and he had reportedly been majorly depressed and admitted to the hospital by his father. Julie later said that their marriage wasn't very romantic, and it was much more, she described it as, quote, family love. Not really sure what that
Kind of in a
means,
relationship for the sake of having the family type of deal.
It's probably the best interpretation. She later admitted, though, that she had only been sexually intimate with her husband 6 times during their marriage and had never seen him fully nude. And they were married for 24 years. So
Definitely odd.
yeah, something's going on. At one point after his stay at the hospital, Herb worked for the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. And, we said earlier he had a sexual fascination with urine. Well, apparently he urinated on a desk and a letter he addressed to the governor and was then basically immediately terminated for this behavior.
I mean, just these couple actions we just described, I think, tell you everything you need to know about Herb.
Yeah.
Something is not right with him.
Yeah, he's on, he's, I don't know what you would call him. He's like kind of on the outskirts of whatever sexual kink he has, or something's a bit off here.
He loves urine.
Yeah, and hey, I mean, if you're into urine, gross, but nothing inherently
I mean, you can
wrong.
drink your urine, so in a pinch.
Yeah, true. I've
Surprised
seen,
he didn't just drink his urine.
yeah, I've seen Bear Grylls do it. So
Yeah.
But clearly odd when you stack everything against the next
But
bit
the
of
dead
information.
crow,
here.
he has this kind of fascination with dead animals. I mean,
yeah,
immediately my mind goes, you start thinking about other serial killers and some of the odd things that they do in their early lives. And
Yeah.
there's definitely some similarities there.
yeah. Dead animals comes up a lot. I know Jeffrey Dahmer was big into like killing animals back then. But here's a clip of
Really the only clip too.
Yeah, and this is just random, really. This is before he was even on police's radar or anything like that. This is Herb on the local news talking about this dead raccoon that was painted over. There are like pavement markings on the side of the road, designate the lines of like.
Which this is fucking bizarre. I've never heard of anybody doing this. There's like roadkill on the road, and rather than picking up the roadkill before painting new lines.
Yeah, it was just like, let's leave it there. And then Herbert then like takes a picture of it and was talking to his son about it. Very odd. Not only just Herbert's thing, which we'll see in a second, but is this a slow news day out in Hamilton County?
Yeah, my God. Why is this even news?
Yeah, really weird.
And he just happens to be out there
to
interview?
Yeah. So here's some of that footage.
The Indiana Department of Transportation maintains over 11,000 miles of roadway, and we paint those miles of roadway each year, and this is just an isolated incident that happened.
The drive-by striping, or whatever.
Herb Baumeister of Carmel saw it all.
I said to my son, they're gonna hit that raccoon with a spray gun, and sure enough, they just striped right over its face and neck. Didn't even move it, no effort to, get it out of the way. So I happened to have a Polaroid with me, so I took a shot of the thing.
A raccoon, which met its demise on the yellow line, became one with the paint. The raccoon has since been removed. This is all that's left.
This was just, the painter should have had a chalk line drawn around his career by state officials. There was no excuse for that. I mean, the poor thing deserved a better fate than that.
So just what is the explanation for this? For that, we went to the state highway department itself.
Again, why is this news?
Shit. It's so stupid.
What on earth?
They got like 4 people to interview as well.
It's so bizarre that this is one of, if not the only clip of Herb Baumeister that's public.
Yeah. Yeah.
So weird.
Yeah.
And he's like trying to be empathetic to the raccoon, being like,
it doesn't seem like fake empathy
Oh,
though?
yeah.
Because he has a little like twinkle in his eye about
it's
it.
almost like he's a little giddy a bit.
Yeah. And he's taking multiple pictures of it as well.
He just happened to have the Polaroid, like,
Yeah, that's so gross.
And the highway department does deserve credit for clearly missing this unfortunate feline about half a mile away.
What a shame. It would have taken just a second to kick that thing or move it somehow out of the way. It deserved a better fate than that.
On the north side, Rick Dawson, Wish TV, News 8.
Yeah, it's just an odd, bizarre circumstance. And it is...
That's the guy urinating on the...
on
everything.
Letter to a governor. I also don't get... He's like, oh man, that thing deserved more compassion. You're the one, you're out there taking pictures of it.
You brought the attention to it.
Yeah. What?
Why didn't you just go move it out of the way then?
Right.
If you're that worried about it. Yeah, it's everything he says is just kind of off. I don't know. But that is Herb Baumeister for you.
Yep.
So by 1988, Herb and Julie decided to go into business together. After borrowing $350,000 in seed money from Herb's mother, they ended up owning 2, some report 3, Save-A-Lot stores in Indianapolis, which, again, similar to Goodwill, no relation to the Save-A-Lot grocery chain, just to be clear. But by the early 90s, these stores were popping off. They were very successful, and they were making about $300,000 a year at its peak. So mind you, this is also in the 90s, so, you can do the calculations there. So they were rolling in it.
Yeah.
They also gave around $50,000 of their profits to a charity for neglected children. An employee and a friend of Herb, Dixie Packard, worked for the couple in the 80s and 90s. Herb and Julie would often hang out with Dixie and her husband. They'd go out dancing, they'd see live music together, including Neil Diamond. And her first impression of Herb was that he was well-dressed, articulate, and very hardworking. And she thought that the Baumeisters really were just this perfectly normal family. But she did notice a few odd things about Herb as time passed by, like the fact that he hanged a fake skeleton on the back of his office door. It's not Halloween, buddy. Like, who just has a skeleton hanging on that? Like, I get it for Halloween, maybe, but
or maybe for
all the time.
Maybe for the lights out studio.
Yeah, exactly.
Do something like I just don't get into just regular old office in the back of a thrift store. Seems a little weird.
This is even weirder, though. One day, Herb asked Dixie into his office as he wanted to show her something. He opened up a drawer in a filing cabinet and told her to look inside. What she saw was a plate of rotting food. Herb was absolutely fascinated with this rotting plate of food. But anybody, including Dixie, was just absolutely disgusted and told him to get rid of it. Because it's like, why the fuck do you just have a
Get
plate
outta
of rotting
here.
food?
Yeah.
Which
Is he fascinated with like decomposition or something? Like, am I reading too far into that, or?
I don't think that's too far.
Okay.
I think, I mean, the food's not, I mean, I guess the food is kind of decomposing.
Right.
But it's also just getting moldy, and who
Probably
knows
smells.
the bugs that are in there and
Oh,
stuff like
God.
So the fact that he finds that fascinating, red flag, right?
Yeah.
Another odd thing was his obsession with the mannequins that he used for displaying clothing in the stores. Herb would store them in his office and in the bathroom even. So you'd go to use the bathroom at the thrift store and you'd have to walk around this maze of mannequins just to
Yeah.
get to the toilet.
It's so stupid.
What the hell? Yeah, bizarre. And he also had a bunch at his house as well. So he
Mhm.
clearly liked the mannequins
Yeah.
for some strange reason.
Yeah.
Dixie said there were so many that it was hard to walk around, but Herb, he seemed to enjoy them and refused to move them anywhere else. She also recalled another incident while she was working one day. There was a lot of furniture across the store that hadn't been selling well. Herb was frustrated, so Dixie suggested that he lower the prices. Herb refused, and he became so angry he started throwing all the furniture into the large trash compactor behind the store. We're talking tables, chairs, and anything he thought wasn't selling. He caused such a scene that all the customers just stood and watched, and this was a display of anger that Herb rarely ever showed the public. So he's definitely got this
There's something behind closed
kind of
doors.
dark side.
Yeah.
And definitely had a temper. Debbie Falls, the sister of a missing man at the time named Richard Douglas Hamilton Jr., or Richie, also worked for Herb. Debbie would fold the clothes and hang them in the Save-A-Lot, and this connection between Herb and a missing person's sister wasn't made until much later. But in the mid-90s, at one of these Save-A-Lots, investigator Mary Wilson eventually tracked down Herb and asked him about the missing men. Her first impression of Herb was that he was a very strange man. He appeared extremely nervous, and he told her that none of his family knew that he had gone to gay bars. So it became very obvious that Herb was living a double life. He publicly appeared as a straight church-going family man, but at night he admitted he would cruise gay bars and pick up young men and even sex workers. Police later confronted Julie about her husband's behavior, and she was shocked. But Herb denied the allegations even though he had admitted them to the police. Others confirmed to have seen Herb at these bars as well, but almost no one knew him by his real name. Using a fake name in gay bars didn't really stick out. Many didn't want their family to know that they were gay, and sometimes men would even lose their jobs if their employers found out. So it's fairly common for people to use fake names. But Herb might have been using the alias Brian Smart for much more nefarious reasons.
So one of the bartenders, Steve Warman, who worked at Our Place, which was the mainstream Indianapolis gay bar that we mentioned earlier, he had seen Herb many times at the bar, and Herb often didn't socialize. He just kind of awkwardly stood off to the side. But every once in a while, he would approach someone and talk to them. But Steve got the impression that Herb was embarrassed of his sexuality and who he was. That was his impression kind of from a distance. But police noticed that his wife, Julie, and the kids would sometimes leave for the whole summer, months at a time. But Herb would stay behind at Fox Hollow Farm. So he would have the whole place to himself for very long stretches of time. And at this point, it was hard for police to confirm if Herb was their guy, but they knew he was at least worth looking into. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough evidence to get a search warrant for Fox Hollow Farm. Both Herb and Julie refused a search of their property, but as time passed, Julie became a bit more suspicious of her husband, and she had even begun divorce proceedings by 1996. After 24 years of marriage. Herb had left Fox Hollow Farm in the meantime, and according to Julie, it was just the long hours they put in at the stores, the pressures of parenting, and later the financial strain of their failing business led to just too much stress in their marriage. Julie then began sharing details of their relationship with her attorney, her divorce attorney, and her attorney thought that some of these details were actually concerning enough to forward over to the police. The prosecutor of Hamilton County at the time, Sonia Learcamp, spoke with Julie about her husband, and she mentioned some pretty disturbing incidents. The one that stood out the most to police happened in December of 1994. So Julie had been downstairs when she saw her son Eric and his friend Matt emerging from the woods behind the Fox Hollow Farm property. If you remember, this is an 18-acre property, and they have a bunch of wood surrounding this house. So they carried something on the end of a stick, and the two boys then came up to the downstairs window. They kind of tapped on it and showed Julie what they had found in the woods, and it was actually a human skull. And on July 8th, 1996, Matt Campbell, the friend who was with Eric, was interviewed by the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, and Matt corroborated the story and confirmed that he had found what he thought was a human skull back in December 1994. So apparently that night, Herb got home, Julie told her husband what had happened, and they found this skull, and she urged him, like, hey, we should call the police. But Herb warned her not to call. He explained that, hey, this skull was actually just from a skeleton that his father had given him. The story that he told was that his father, he was a respected anesthesiologist who had just a weird, odd collection of anatomy objects, and one was a skeleton. And he later gifted some of this collection down to his son Herbert. He told his family that a raccoon must have gotten into their garage and dragged the skull out into the woods. Julie apparently thought the story was just believable enough. Herb then took the skull, and it was never seen again. So what do you think of that one?
Oh, man.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I can see how he probably was able to convince her.
Yeah. I mean, I was kind of saying this, but I think there's a point where you're at a crossroads, right? And you're like, okay, do I just keep kind of the delusional blinders on a little bit, or do I maybe confront a more horrific future that would implode my entire life? I think maybe she was considering that and was just like, oh yeah, all right, the story with the raccoon, and I wouldn't think about it too much. More of like a self-preservation kind of thing.
Yeah, and probably just took some time to think about it more. In the moment, you can just kind of get caught up in, especially if he's convincing about it.
Yeah.
But the more you think about it, you're like, oh, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense.
Right. Had she ever seen, this is what I don't understand, has she ever seen a skeleton in the garage? Wouldn't you kind of know what's in storage?
Well, think back to the fake skeleton on the back of his door at the thrift store. So, he's already got some of these kind of oddities. He's got mannequins everywhere. She already knows he's a weird dude.
Yeah.
So I think your first gut reaction to this is going to be like, this is not what I think it is. And she's clearly not thinking that this is a human being that Herb murdered. And so I think she's just kind of like, okay, this is really weird. I'm going to kind of keep this in the back of my mind, because as time goes on, the relationship's getting worse and worse, and she's, they're not talking anymore. So the attachment to him is starting to diminish. So she's like, okay, well, maybe there is something more going on here.
Yeah.
Maybe it's time to have police just do a search, because I don't really know what's going on, and I don't know if I can trust Herb and what he's telling me.
I mean, clearly she did find it odd enough to then tell her divorce attorney, right?
Right.
So like there was at some point, it wasn't just she totally believed his lie. I think at some point she was like, nah, wait a minute, this doesn't add up.
Which I think, lends to your point that she knew the repercussions of this if, her hunch was right. If this was as bad as she potentially thought it was, could potentially destroy both of their lives in a lot of ways.
And maybe probably a lot of our listeners too, like maybe it's just like the true crime brain would be like, if my partner, like, hey, we found a human skull in the backyard, immediately call police. No doubt, right? Like I wouldn't even hesitate. Like, yeah, absolutely. Let's get way ahead of this and immediately call police, because I don't know what's going on. I don't know if it would, like if Kendall found a human skull in the backyard.
Your first thing you do is call the authorities and try to figure out where it came from, whose skull is it, what happened, and it really does make you wonder though. And I know a ton of people speculate with this, is like, how much did she know?
Yeah,
and
still
was this kind of that tipping point for her where she was like, okay, my suspicions over these years, because again, she was gone from the house for several months at a time, but she was there a lot. And so unless everything that went down with her happened while she was gone, which is possible, but it's like you didn't see these other signs. And, when especially talk about some of the other evidence that's uncovered there, you're like, really didn't know
Yeah.
that he was up to these things and into this kind of thing. I mean, when he's getting fired from his job for a year, like, she had to have known something's
like
off with my
hospitalized
husband.
and for, whatever. It
He's
was
not well.
major depression and stuff. Yeah.
I don't know about you, but Austin and I just delay going to the doctors for a lot of reasons.
Yeah. I had a broken bone for like 6 months and I just refused to go in.
You made a homemade cast and everything.
Yeah. Yep.
And it just never got better. It's just a pain to find a doctor these days through your insurance website or just Googling stuff. You can never figure out, what reviews are real. And you got to usually call the office, wait on hold to schedule an appointment. But with ZocDoc, the free app and website where you can search and compare high quality in-network doctors and click instantly to book appointments, those days are gone. We love ZocDoc. We both have used it recently. I used it to find my oral surgeon for my wisdom teeth, which was a huge win.
Nice.
It was
Yeah.
a 10 out of 10 experience. The patient reviews on ZocDoc were extremely accurate.
Nice.
And I did everything over email.
No
which is
waking
like best case scenario.
and no waking up during your anesthesia.
No, dude.
Oh, lucky.
It was
must be
flawless.
nice. Nice. For those who don't know, short story, but I became conscious for a hot second while I was under anesthesia during my wisdom teeth removal when they were cracking my bottom left one in half to extract it, because it was not a fun time. I was just like, I couldn't do anything though. I was just locked in there, kind of screaming in my head.
Hell no.
But eventually, luckily, I went back under after. But yeah, I recently used it for finding a good dentist. They were great.
You can find dentists, PCPs, dermatologists, any type of medical provider, you name it. ZocDoc helps you find it. Plus, you can filter by your insurance info, which makes it really
I love
easy.
that.
And you can just scroll through and see who takes your insurance. You can look at the patient reviews. You can find appointments, sometimes even the same day if you're lucky. But most of the times you can book an appointment between 24 and 72 hours, which, it just makes it effortless, really.
Yeah.
There's no other place to book appointments like ZocDoc. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/lightsout to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today.
That's ZocDoc.com/lightsout. ZocDoc.com/lightsout.
But by June 1996, Julie and Herb were no longer speaking. Herb was at their lake house when Julie gave police permission to search the Fox Hollow Farm property. A cursory search was performed near the area where the human skull is believed to have been found. Police soon discovered what looked like burnt human bone fragments in the woods about 100 yards from the house. Police then contacted Dr. Stephen Naraki, a distinguished forensic anthropologist, and he brought a team out and began uncovering the area. Sections of the woods were roped off in a grid pattern, and the team carefully uncovered and extracted bones from the soil. Each grid section was carefully examined. As police continued the cursory search deeper in the woods, the bones of a human foot were discovered in another location. Officers were required to put a red flag into the ground everywhere they discovered something suspicious. As the day went on, a sea of red flags covered the soil throughout the woods near Fox Hollow Farm. Shotgun shells and handcuffs were also found, and an arm bone had been discovered sticking through the handcuffs. So when you start finding all of this, you're like, holy shit.
Yeah.
Some really, really horrific shit has been going on this
Really
property.
dark. Yeah.
And the only person that makes any sense is Herb.
Right.
So we actually, there's some great archived footage of this search. So here's a clip of that.
The biggest news from Fox Hollow Farm on this Wednesday came early.
Positively 5 bodies out there. By the bones he found yesterday, I believe they found about 75 bones. And through that, they was able to identify the 2 other bodies definitely were out there. So we do have 5.
Authorities still believe the bones have been buried in the 18-acre estate for the last 9 to 18 months. Anthropologists say the bones are definitely that of adults. Now, that was likely help law enforcement, but it's not enough.
We have nothing at this time and will not until the anthropologist can give us some kind of sex and hopefully a cause of death.
Digging at the site concluded today. A search party walk through the property is scheduled for Friday.
It's real frustrating. I mean, we have to wait. Everybody's curious. We have our own thoughts, but we have to wait until we get an answer from the anthropologist.
That's expected to take 30 to 40 days.
What's really odd is that throughout this entire extensive search, investigators could not uncover any identifiable skulls that were intact, like the one that was found, as we described, in 1994. So it's theorized that after his son's friend had found the skull in the woods in 94, Herb began to burn the bodies. The original search of the property lasted about 2 weeks, and by the end, thousands of human bone fragments and remains were recovered. 3 areas in the woods around the property have been designated search areas. Area 1 was just behind the house where the woods began, and the bones discovered here were mostly burned. In many cases, burning a body does not turn the bones into ash, but it does fragment them. The next area was more to the west, and those bones were also burned. Even further west, toward the edge of the property, was Area 3, and the remains here were not burned. During the search, 2 men had approached from the west edge of the property, and they mentioned a creek nearby, which might have had more evidence. This small creek ran adjacent to the Baumeister's property. Almost immediately, more human remains were discovered, and none of them had been burned either. Detective Kerry Milligan said that he had never seen that many human remains in one place ever. And people who have been to this property have even said this is greater than most mass casualty events.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
Yeah. I think the amount of bones, it was like the second most unidentified remains in U.S. history. It was here on this property.
Absolutely insane. God.
And I looked it up really quick. Burning bones entirely requires extremely high temperatures in an environment of almost 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, which you obviously...
We're talking about like cremation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You just can't get that in a fire that you have in your backyard. So that explains why they're just all splintered and fractured.
Countless bones scattered the length of the creek bed that ran along the property, and many of them didn't even need to be dug up or sifted. Ribs were just sticking out of the banks of the creek. Full jaw bones with teeth still in them rested on the dirt. And initially, investigators couldn't even wrap their heads around how many bodies were actually out there. Early on, Hamilton County prosecutor Sonia Learcamp estimated that 3 to 5 bodies had been discovered in the initial search areas and possibly 2 more near the creek. But in the end, they believed they had found 11 victims in total. There was also a section of the property they called the mulch pile, and this is where Herb was believed to have been piling tree limbs, leaves, and grass clippings. He was then placing the bodies in the pile of mulch and covering them up to hide them. Over the years, about 10 or 12 pieces of human remains have been recovered since the initial investigation. Modern estimates claim there are at least 25 victims in the collection of remains recovered from Fox Hollow Farm. Since the bodies have been so badly burned or completely decayed, the causes of death could not be determined. During the initial search of Fox Hollow Farm, Herb and his son Eric were up at the family cabin at Lake Wawasee. Once human remains were uncovered, Julie panicked and feared that Herb was unstable, and she wanted their son brought home immediately. Eric was eventually brought home by police, but they just left Herb at the cabin, which is fucking nuts. You're pulling multiple bodies out of his property and you're just...
This is a huge failure. Huge failure.
You're not bringing him in? According to police, the prosecutor didn't think there was enough evidence to arrest Herb yet.
What more do you
People are arrested
need?
on far less evidence than this.
Right?
Unbelievable.
I was shocked at this information.
Major miss by the prosecutor.
Huge.
So no warrant was put out for his arrest. Police did not even put surveillance on him, which is even more shocking.
Yeah.
By their logic, since the causes of death for the victims was unknown, this technically wasn't a homicide case, which makes no sense whatsoever. What all these people just ran into a bear out in the woods or something?
Right,
What
yeah.
the hell do you think happened?
And again, you don't need to know that this is technically a homicide case to arrest someone. Like, I think that's just it's just an excuse to be like, that's why we didn't. They're trying to kind of cover up their tracks for the failure.
As you can imagine, this move by law enforcement was heavily scrutinized, is still heavily scrutinized, because it just makes absolutely no sense why they let Indiana's most prolific serial killer just go unchecked, not even surveil him. It's just that could have potentially solved the case, and just, justice could have been served for these victims.
Yeah.
But instead they just said, no, we don't have enough evidence, and just delayed it.
Yeah. I'm kind of the opinion that it's not even like could potentially have solved the case. I think they could have 100% solved the entire case if they had just arrested him there.
I think, so they have to link him to the remains in some way, shape, or form. But that would be far easier if he was, they had him live in person.
And as we'll find out with the videotapes coming up,
that too,
that would have been huge,
able to find
right?
critical evidence.
Yeah. But, as you would expect, Herb soon fled the lake house and police could not track him down. A few days later, on July 3rd, 1996, Herb Baumeister was found dead in Pinery Provincial Park, Ontario, Canada. He was found lying on his back in front of his car. An autopsy concluded he had shot himself in the forehead with a .357 Magnum. And what's odd is that the witness, Mark Layer, who found the body, claimed that he never saw a gun nearby, which has kind of stirred up some rumors. And other exaggerated rumors have even claimed that there was like a satanic altar near his body.
Which I think both those have been debunked.
Yeah.
Because I believe there is an evidence photo of the .357 Magnum
at the scene
that they
right?
recovered. Yeah.
He was, from what he was saying, it's like there was no gun when I saw him, and then it was planted and they took a picture
insinuating that he was potentially murdered as opposed to him taking his own life.
Right. I don't really buy it, but especially we'll find out here. There was a note left behind, and the condition of the vehicle doesn't really make sense for him to be murdered. But Canadian authorities told Indiana police that Herb had actually been spotted the day before. He was sleeping in his car, and when confronted, police had seen videotapes in the backseat of the car. So this is also really crucial, and this is what I was talking about earlier. Indiana police were hoping to find a taped confession or some form of like recording of his crimes in the car, because when police had searched Fox Hollow Farm, they actually found a loose vent in the basement ceiling near the bar. And police wondered then if Herbert had actually placed a video camera up there at one point to document maybe what he was doing to his victims. And the video camera would have been positioned in a way that would aim at this chaise lounge that was down
like pool
in his
chair
basement.
Yeah.
Yep. When police initially asked Julie if Herb had done a lot of videotaping, she confirmed that he had, and she led investigators to a storage room, but the shelf there where Herb had once kept his videotapes was mysteriously empty. It's theorized he was recording his sexual activity and possibly also creating snuff films that included violent crimes against his victims. In the basement, police also found a VHS copying system. But unfortunately, when they recovered his vehicle in Canada, there were no videos inside, and no videos have ever been found. It's assumed that Herb destroyed them before committing suicide, and the floor mats and all the carpeting inside the vehicle had also been stripped, which is odd.
Which I think clearly points to he's A, disposed of the videotapes, B, disposed of all the carpeting in his vehicle because he likely transported bodies in it.
DNA in there.
Because the car is interesting because it seems like that may have been a method for, if he murdered his victims in the pool or in the house or, around the back of the property, he then used his vehicle to drive them out to the burn sites, possibly. Or potentially there's just DNA from the abduction itself.
Right, yeah.
And we still don't even know how that all went down. Per se.
No, yeah.
But I think it's really very clear. Yeah.
I think how they got to
his
house
property
in the first place.
Yeah. And I think it's pretty obvious that he was recording what was going on. I mean, and Mark Goodyear, who we'll talk about more later, also confirms this as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very, very, when you just see this vent and the pictures from when police searched the property, I mean, it seems like that's absolutely what he was doing.
And his wife confirming, like, yeah, he videotaped all the time, and they're just all gone.
Right. And I mean, the guy had a Polaroid camera out just happened on the side of the road
for
with that
raccoons.
raccoon.
Yeah. So he was clearly documenting a lot. Yeah. In the end, Herb had only left this weird rambling 3-page note behind where he mentioned business troubles and his failing marriage. And apparently the Save-A-Lot business was nearly bankrupt at this time. They had failed to pay employees and even shut off power at one of the locations. But Herb did not admit any criminal activity, and he did not mention anything about the bones found at his property. Julie and the children then moved out of Fox Hollow Farm and back to Indianapolis to start over after this. In the years since, people have wondered, we were saying this, how Julie could have been unaware of what was going on at the house. But, it is important to remember that her relationship with her husband was strained and unconventional, to say the least. They were rarely intimate, according to her. Herb was reportedly a difficult person to be around, and the couple would go very long periods of time without even speaking to each other. If you remember, Julie and the children would spend months away from the house, either at the lake house or they did have this other property in the suburbs, and they would just leave Herb alone by himself at Fox Hollow Farm. It's believed that he was carrying out his crimes alone during these times when his wife and children were out of the house. And when the family finally came across that skull in 1994, he had an immediate excuse for it. And according to Kerry Milligan, former detective for the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, he believed that Julie didn't know much about Herb's horrific activities, although, she might have been suspicious. Obviously, it was worth bringing up the skull to her divorce attorney. So I think maybe she was piecing something together over time. And here's a thing that we can't really get too deep into, but it's worth mentioning. Herb was also a suspect in the I-70 Strangler case, which is the nickname for an unidentified serial killer who murdered at least 12 men and boys between 15 and 29 years old in Indiana and Ohio between 1980 and 1991. This case is just far too large to go into detail, but Herb was suspected because the victims included gay men who were picked up from gay bars in Indianapolis, much like, this case. 9 victims were officially linked to Herb. The bodies were dumped near I-70, often into rivers, streams, and ditches in the countryside, and each had been strangled. Herb was the prime suspect in 1999. Many point out that the victims found near I-70 suddenly stopped showing up around 1991, and they speculate it's because Herb had bought Fox Hollow Farm in 1988 and began dumping the bodies there instead. And the I-70 Strangler case has never been solved to this day.
I think it's, I see why the connection's been made.
Yeah, for sure.
It seems like he would have been in the area.
We know he's into strangulation. We know many of his victims are gay men. So that all adds up. And
just another reason to rip out all of the carpet in your vehicle as well if it was used for, dozens of abductions and murders possibly.
True. But, either way, police figured that Herb was solely responsible for the crimes at Fox Hollow Farm. In the aftermath of the discovery, Hamilton County conducted DNA testing to identify several victims found at the property. And these were John Lee, also known as Johnny Bayer, who was 20 years old, went missing on May 28th, 1993. Jeffrey Allen, or Jeff Jones, 31 years old, missing on July 6th, 1993. Stephen Sperlin Hale, age 28, missing on April 1st, 1994. Alan Wayne Broussard, 28, missing on June 6th, 1994. Roger Allen Goodlet, 33, missing on July 22nd, 1994. Michael Frederick, or Mike Kieran, 45, missing on March 31st, 1995. And lastly, Richard, or Richie Douglas Hamilton Jr., age 20, missing on July 31st, 1993.
I think it's, when I'm thinking about the I-70 Strangler, I think it just speaks to this guy was, by the time he got to Fox Hollow Farm, he was essentially, an expert on abducting individuals. Sure. And I think if you put the 2 and 2 together, I think it does make it seem more possible that he did potentially operate alone. If he had all of this prior experience as the I-70 strangler, it's possible his murders got easier.
Yeah, he was so crafty by the time they were in that house. Yeah.
That maybe it's not as far-fetched to say that he operated alone.
Sure.
Because he had it down to a science at that point.
Yeah.
Which is just terrifying. I mean, this guy for years is doing this.
Yeah.
While also maintaining this double life,
Yeah.
it's just terrifying. God. This episode of Lights Out is brought to you by Wild Grain, our favorite provider of high quality, homemade tasting, delicious carbs, baby. We love Wild Grain. They've got artisanal breads, pastries, pastas, donuts, and those delicious chocolate chip cookies, man. That honestly, I would have a subscription just for the chocolate chip cookies.
Absolutely.
I'd eat them every day.
They're so good.
And then their pastas, man. You'll never want to buy boxed pasta again because this pasta tastes like it was just made that day.
Yeah.
It's so delicious. It all just comes straight to your door, frozen. You just throw it in your freezer. Then when you're ready to make it, you either throw it in the oven for, 20, 30 minutes, or you throw it in the pot of boiling water and you've got essentially homemade bread pasta.
I don't know how they do it. I don't know what witchcraft or like, it's like undercooked a little bit and then you're like finishing the cooking process, because all of it always tastes like it's fresh out of the baker's, or like fresh pasta that was just handmade by an Italian woman. It's crazy.
It's absolutely delicious. And we're not just saying that. Plus, it's a family-owned business, which we love.
Yeah,
it's owned by a family, a couple, and they just clearly have, like Austin said, figured out the magic to bring everybody homemade tasting breads, pastas, pastries, you name it.
Croissants.
Yeah. Oh, the croissants were so good. I had some of the Wild Grain croissants on Christmas.
Oh yeah.
So good.
So crazy good. I'm a sick freak. I like to, even though they're already buttery as is, I slather it with more butter. I can't help.
You just melt a bunch of butter and stick it.
Yeah. And they give you that really good butter as a part of the package deal, which is awesome.
It's like a European, like Dutch butter.
It's really good.
Top quality. They even have a new gluten-free box and a plant-based box that is 100% vegan. So they cater to absolutely everybody. And it just takes the hassle out of baking. I love baked goods, but I don't like baking because it's difficult.
It's a lot of work.
At a mile high above sea level.
Yeah, it's like chemistry, but you have to add those weird factors into the baking process.
The water, the timing.
Yeah, because it's like the evaporation's different out here. Yeah, when you're a mile up.
Never turns out right.
Nope.
So just eliminate, and it's just a mess too. That's
the flour gets everywhere.
Messy kitchens.
Yeah.
And when I cook, it's usually a fucking mess. And I hate the cleanup part after. I love cooking, but I hate the cleanup.
Yeah.
But with this, it's just pop it out of the freezer, right into the oven. 30 minutes later, you're like, wow, seems like I just baked this in my kitchen today.
At most, you're maybe cleaning a cookie sheet. That's it.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
It's amazing stuff.
Yeah.
So are you ready to bring all of your favorite carbs right to your doorstep? Be sure to check out Wild Grain so you can begin building your own box of artisanal breads, pastas, and pastries. And for a limited time, Wild Grain is offering our listeners $30 off the first box plus free delicious croissants in every box when you go to wildgrain.com/lightsout to start your subscription.
That's right. You heard us. Free croissants in every box and $30 off your first box when you go to wildgrain.com/lightsout. That's wildgrain.com/lightsout. Or you can use promo code lightsout at checkout.
Richie's sister, Debbie Falls, as we mentioned, had worked at Save a Lot with Herb, and she was very close with her brother, Richie. According to her, Richie had never come out to their family, and she last saw him with an unidentified man in 1993. In the aftermath of the Fox Hollow Farm search, Debbie and the rest of their family received a femur, rib, and some teeth in a box, and they ended up burying Richie in a baby casket. This was a similar experience for many of the identified victims' families since it was difficult to identify all of the human remains that had been recovered from the property. After Herb's suicide, Hamilton County had stopped any additional testing. They had reportedly spent about $14,000 on the DNA identification process, and this is pretty fucked up.
Yeah.
If loved ones or family members wanted additional testing to identify a potential victim, they would have to pay for it themselves.
That's
just sick.
Yeah.
This is your responsibility, and you let this go in your county unchecked.
Yeah.
So that's the very least you can do at this point
Mm-hmm.
is pay to identify these victims. Like we mentioned, it's estimated that at least 25 victims were collected at the property, and the county hadn't even identified half of them. Like, well, he's dead, so that's the end, basically.
Mm-hmm.
According to family members of Alan Livingston, who went missing August of 1993, the local police didn't want to put any more resources into the case due to the fact that the victims were gay men. Detective Thomas Green from the Indianapolis Police Department was even quoted saying, quote, "If anyone at this stage was a victim, I think it would be his wife and his family, meaning Julie and her children," which is just so fucking dismissive. What are you talking about? People died.
Yeah, those are the victims. What are you talking about?
Also,
But, I mean, that goes to show just like the sentiment, right?
Yep.
Oh, like the real victims are actually Julie and their
picture
children.
perfect family. Come on.
Yeah.
Also, when Julie was first approached by detectives, they told her, quote, "We are investigating your husband in relation to homosexual homicide." Julie asked, quote, "Can you tell me what a homosexual homicide is?"
Right?
Yeah, I mean, just
Even using that language to, I mean, it's clearly they're using it derogatorily, right?
absolutely. Alan's family believed without a doubt Alan's remains were somewhere at Fox Hollow Farm, but since the original investigation came to a standstill, his remains were not identified. Adam Williams, the son of Jerry Williams Comer, was last seen in Indianapolis on August 8, 1995, and still has not received any definitive proof or remains as a result of the investigation. His father is still considered a missing person. Authorities later publicly and posthumously linked the unsolved disappearance of Jerry to the case, although his remains have not technically been identified. Adam described his father, Jerry, as a man with a big laugh. He worked as a builder and had done major projects such as the White River Canal and several airport expansions. Jerry had also started the Sarge Guide with his partner, Ray. This was an LGBTQ-friendly bar guide. After Jerry's divorce from his wife, he sat his son Adam down and explained that he was gay and he would go live with his partner, Ray. Adam last saw his father on his birthday in 1995. If Adam could have talked to his dad today, he would have told him that he was proud of him, especially for being confident in his sexuality at a time when it really wasn't accepted. In the 90s, Jerry and Ray had been figureheads in the gay community of Indianapolis. Both of them had renovated a popular gay bar, Metro nightclub, which has been a staple in the LGBTQ+ community since 1990. Adam was initially shielded from the conversations about his father's disappearance as a kid, but when he became an adult, he started looking into it. Jerry's car had been discovered abandoned in the parking lot of the Castleton Square Mall in Indianapolis. There was a bit of cash inside, but there was no signs of Jerry. Adam theorizes that Jerry might have met with Herb at some point. Jerry had been involved with clothing and food drives for people who were displaced and were connected to the local LGBTQ+ community. And since Herb owned the thrift stores, Adam figured Jerry would have been in contact with him about clothing. Jerry often visited thrift stores for his charity work and for decorating the bars that he designed. Adam believes his father would have gone out to Fox Hollow Farm with Herb, a wealthy man, if he had offered to donate to his cause. Experts have expressed that Herb was most likely very calculated in choosing his victims. But again, it's still a mystery if Herb truly acted alone, because there's speculation that potentially he had somebody lure his victims to him.
Mm-hmm.
In Adam's opinion, his father Jerry probably had an acquaintance who was friends with Herb, and that's how he was lured to the property. Besides being a gay man, Jerry Williams Comer didn't match any of the other profiles, especially because he was in a long-term committed relationship. So it makes sense that Jerry was lured to the house for some reason other than sex or possibly by an accomplice. It's unclear how thoroughly police looked into other suspects or potential accomplices in the original investigation, but in recent years, a wave of new suspicions has changed the shape of the case. And it really seems like, as far as we know, again, we don't have all the files, they likely didn't look into anybody else.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It seems like they checked out really fast after. I was like, oh, it was Herbert.
Clearly Herb.
No, that
It's
was
on his
it.
property.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably maybe not even registered.
Right.
Or they just didn't care.
Yeah. So it really didn't take long for people to start poking holes into this investigation. And if the police were going to leave Herb as the prime suspect, many began wondering, well, how Herb was transporting countless victims who were full-grown men out into the woods, hundreds of yards from his home in very dense woods by himself? I think that's a fair question, right? Although the mainstream theory was that Herb was killing his victims in the pool area, some have also suggested that Herb possibly restrained his victims and forced them into the woods before killing them out there. You know, if you remember, they found the handcuffs with the arm bone through it out there. Lengths of rope and shotgun shells were also found in the woods, and that strengthened this theory. But many also wonder if Herb possibly had an accomplice who helped lure his victims to the property and also helped him dispose of the bodies. Years passed after the initial investigation. Many families were left without answers, but by 2022, another search of the property was conducted, and this is when they found an additional bone and several more locations where bodies might potentially be buried. In 2023, Sharon Livingston, who was a mother of missing person Alan Livingston, who we mentioned earlier, she had been diagnosed with cancer, and Eric Prenger, who was a cousin of Alan Livingston, wanted to put more pressure on police to find out what happened to Alan so they could find closure for his aunt Sharon. So he contacted the Hamilton County Coroner's Office. So the county coroner, Jeff Jellison, was deeply moved by Eric's phone call, and by his own admission, Jeff generally knew what had happened out there at Fox Hollow Farm 3 decades earlier, but he really didn't understand the extent of it all at the time. As he looked more into it, his first goal was to track down all of the remains. So he made a call to the former coroner, who told him the remains found at Fox Hollow Farm were in storage at the University of Indianapolis, and they had kept them in a lab to preserve the remains. So Jeff got in touch with the university, and they told him they had about 10,000 bones and bone fragments from Fox Hollow Farm. The vast majority of the human remains had not been analyzed or connected to a victim. And to put this into perspective, like I said, this was the second largest collection of unidentified human remains in the U.S. at the time. The first being the collapse of the World Trade Center. That was number one. And this is number two. That is wild to think about. That was another moment when I was researching this where I was like,
it
what?
really puts it into perspective.
Yeah.
The gravity of this investigation and just the sheer amount of search area and the sheer amount of human remains that have been recovered.
Right.
It's insane.
And I can't even wrap my head around just the man hours and the resources it would take to identify all that. Like, that is just a sheer amount of human remains. But Jeff then went public with the new investigation and confirmed to local media that he would attempt to use DNA to identify the rest of the victims, because if you remember, they had stopped the DNA testing. In August of 2023, Jeff spoke to the public through WRTV News, and he requested that if anyone knew someone who was missing in their family, to contact the Hamilton County Coroner's Office, and they would then collect DNA swabs from the family and enter that data into the missing persons database to try and connect them. Jeff was soon contacted by a former county councilman who served as a councilman during the initial investigation, and that text message read, "Jeff, just saw the story about your interest in reopening the Baumeister case. What has happened to create such an enormous expense for the county and take away manpower resources from so many law enforcement agencies?" Crazy that someone who even just doesn't have any more horses in this race to contact Jeff and be like, "Why are you wasting
trying to sway
money?"
him? Yeah.
Odd.
How about the fact that people's loved ones are missing?
Yeah.
And there's a good chance that those remains could be them.
Right.
Doesn't everybody deserve, to be put to have a proper burial and, closure? It's just,
it's
shocking.
I think people like this former county councilman saw it more as like hey, you're outing us for not doing our job back then by doing.
Why are you bringing attention to this?
Yeah, exactly.
We thought we put this to bed a long time ago.
So as the coroner's office began collecting and testing new DNA evidence, Jeff was soon contacted by Indiana State Police in October 2023, and they notified him of their first DNA match for an unidentified victim. So that was not that long after they reopened that they already found a match. And Out of the thousands of remains, who was it? It was, if you remember, Alan Livingston. He was the first one identified. And his family, that was the family that was saying, we have no doubt that he's out there. It's just never been confirmed. So they finally confirmed Alan Livingston was there. Eric, his cousin, took that as Alan kind of saying, thank you. And after about 30 years, Alan's family had always believed he was found at Fox Hollow, and now they were finally able to bury him. After Alan was identified, the hope was that if more victims could be identified, their history could piece together what happened out at Fox Hollow Farm. Manuel Resendez, who was 34, was the next to be officially identified, and he was last seen at a gay bar in downtown Indianapolis on August 6th, 1993. In January 2024, Jeff Jellison announced the identification of his remains had been recovered in that initial 1996 search from Fox Hollow Farm, and the remains matched a family reference sample that was submitted in early 2023.
Good for Jeff.
Yeah.
I really like Jeff Jellison.
Mm-hmm. Same.
Because it's like, where are people's morals, man?
You have no conscience.
No.
Yeah. It's
like, this is just the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And why are you questioning it after all these years, especially if you're retired? Who cares if you look bad at this point? How about just owning up to, we made a mistake?
Yeah, swallow your pride. Yeah.
Yeah. It's shocking.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about Fox Hollow Farm today. Well, it has a new owner, Robert Graves, which is just kind of ironic.
Out of all the
he even
names.
makes a joke like Robin Graves. It's just like,
really
it's
weird.
Very weird. Yeah. And this guy's kind of odd too. But in 2004, the property was listed at $2.8 million, but later sold for $987,000. He and his wife, Vicky, had a priest bless the house when they moved in, which is, there's some speculation on whether or not he knew
right
the house that he was buying.
Come on.
You knew. And I'm pretty sure they have to disclose that in real estate transaction anyway.
Or it's like you working with your real estate agent. You're like, hey, why did this property go from $2.8 million to $987,000? I think that would come up in conversation long before you actually buy the house.
Well, Robert Graves has a huge collection of articles about the property and its history, as well as the crime scene photos. He also co-wrote a book about the investigation in 2019 titled The Horrors of Fox Hollow Farm, unraveling the history and hauntings of a serial killer's home. Robert has continued to find human remains on the property that he has turned over to the University of Indianapolis, and he continues to cooperate with police in hopes the investigation will come to an end one day. But yeah, we'll show you a clip here featuring Robert, as well as the Fox Hollow Farm property.
At 6, we're getting a new look at the Westfield farm where police discovered dozens of remains from young men back in 1996.
Yeah, take a look here. Drone Cam 13 captured the latest images of Fox Hollow Farm this afternoon, 26 years after the gruesome discovery there. And it comes just 24 hours away after a renewed push to identify the rest of the unknown victims.
Tonight, our John Duran is taking us step-by-step through the significant locations on this infamous property.
You'll see this ravine.
26 years later.
This goes back to Cool Creek.
The memories are still fresh.
This is the area where most of the intact bones were found.
It's history Robert Graves lives with.
When we first got here, we decided that we were going to try to put all this behind us, but you can't get away from it. It's always that place.
He moved into the Fox Hollow Farm 15 years ago, but in 1996, it was the home of Herb Baumeister, who allegedly killed dozens of men and left their remains on the property.
This is where it happened.
Remains Graves still uncovers to this day.
We don't go looking for them, but they do turn up, and I take them to the University of Indianapolis.
We will have to conduct a very large-scale investigation in which DNA profiling is attempted on all of those samples because we have an open population. So we are unsure exactly how many people are represented.
Forensic teams from the University of Indianapolis were searching these woods for weeks back in 1996 behind the home of then-owner Herb Baumeister. And they're excited there's a renewed interest in trying to find the identities of the remaining victim.
We do have an estimated 10,000 samples that need to be addressed here.
They need the victims' family members to come forward.
We have more unidentified human remains cases in the state of Indiana than we have family reference samples. So that means in general, not just from 26 years ago.
I think it's a good thing. There's certainly a lot of families that don't have answers.
And they're hoping these new efforts produce just that.
It looks like he's done some landscaping on the property because I think he's cut down a bunch of trees that were there.
Yeah.
The property looks a little bit different than when Herb lived there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it really is just shocking.
Yeah.
And a lot of work is going to have to go into, getting these remains identified. And obviously they need the samples to compare them to.
Yeah.
And then also the cost just to test DNA sample. I know it really varies in cost. I'm trying to remember the last time that I looked into what it costs to just process a DNA sample, but I think it's at least several $1,000s per sample.
Man.
So you take that, times it by 10,000, and just at that, I mean, you're looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars required to do this. But in recent years, the property has become a hotbed for paranormal activity, and Robert has allowed several paranormal investigators onto his property. He first noticed odd things in 2010 when a colleague moved into the apartment above the garage. Psychics suggested that the colleague, Joe LeBlanc, was targeted because he was around the same age of the murder victims. And one psychic believed Herb and 4 of the victims were haunting the home. During one paranormal investigation, someone allegedly recorded the disembodied voice of Herb saying, quote, "took a pipe to the skulls. Some wonder if this is why no skulls were found at the property." Over the years, countless paranormal research teams have visited the property, including Paranormal Witness in 2012, and of course, Zach Bagans and Ghost Adventures in 2014. Mm-hmm. But one of the strangest investigations came from Jane Gerlach and Russ Walker, the 2 paranormal filmmakers, and they visited the property in 2023 for a paranormal investigation. Jane was also able to get in touch with Mark Goodyear, the man that broke open the case by telling police about his odd experience with a man obsessed with erotic asphyxiation. In their conversations, Mark confessed to Jane that he had actually dated Herb for 2 years. Even though in the original police questioning, he said he had only met the mysterious man once and didn't know his real name. He told her that Herb never once harmed him, and he confessed that he had made up his original story so that he could help direct the investigation and possibly get a search warrant for the property, which only half makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Herb had apparently confessed some of what he had been doing to his victims, and according to Mark, Herb had also been pulling the teeth out of the victims' skulls and would toss them down the halls of the house. And any of the conversations they had about what was going on were always one-sided, while Herb was allegedly under the influence of cocaine. Mark has denied any involvement in the crimes. But in one of Jane's odd phone calls with Mark, he said, quote, "If I allow him to be this grand monster in my mind, how could I live? So I've changed him in my mind to where he's just not so bad." It's just, this guy is, reading his quotes does not do it justice. I highly recommend that you go watch this docuseries because he's interviewed extensively in it.
Mm-hmm.
And you really need to hear these words and, these quotes from his own mouth, because there's just something very unsettling about him, in my opinion.
Agreed.
Whether or not he's involved, I don't know, but I find him highly suspicious. But we'll talk about him more here in a minute. Apparently, Mark had attended the funeral of Richie Hamilton Jr. and even hugged his mother there. Richie's sister Debbie thought it was suspicious that Mark was possibly the only one who got away from Herb unscathed, which I think is very, very weird.
Yeah.
And she's also of the opinion that Herb couldn't have committed these crimes alone. She believes that someone lured her brother to Herb Baumeister's home. Many think that if Herb had an accomplice, that man would have allegedly been Mark Goodyear. So, Mark, this is where you really lean one of two ways. You either think Mark Goodyear's just full of shit, inserting him into this investigation, into this case for, I don't know, attention. I have no idea. Or he is possibly involved in some way.
Yeah.
And to what extent?
Yeah. I ping-ponged back and forth. I was like, this guy is full of shit. And then back to like, this guy might be, legitimately, possibly even a perpetrator at some point. But Yeah.
It's impossible to get a read on him.
Yeah. And I think he keeps it that way, right?
Yes.
I think
it's
strategy.
all strategic.
Yeah. So on September 11, 2023, Jane and Russ, who were the paranormal filmmakers, met with Jeff Jellison, the Hamilton County coroner who reopened the investigation, to show him the odd remarks made by Mark Goodyear. And Jeff came to the conclusion that Mark knew far too much and he wasn't just a survivor. Russ, Jane, and Jeff then came up with a plan to get Mark out to the property, and the filmmakers agreed to meet at Fox Hollow Farm on September 17th, 2023. When they arrived, Mark was immediately upset that they had brought cameras, so he requested that his face not be shown. He then took them on a tour through the house and told them what he remembered from decades previous. When they reached the pool area, he showed them where he would choke Herb, and Mark said that Herb would often speak about the odd facial expressions of a dying person as he pleasured himself, and Mark was supposed to repeat these things back to him so Herb could finish, essentially. He also admitted that he used to look through the sitting room window out into the backyard where he would see, or he claimed to see, a large burn pile, and he said he could clearly see human heads, and anyone who could look into the backyard could obviously see what it was. And during this tour with the paranormal investigators, Mark Goodyear pointed out the incorrect location of the burn pile, which is odd. He said it was near the patio, but it was actually much, much further out into the woods. So according to the current owner, Robert Graves, Mark also admitted to him that he had seen bodies at the property, although Robert believes that Mark was not involved in the crimes. He only, wants to insert himself into the investigation. That's what Robert Graves believes. In Jane Gerlach's opinion, the paranormal filmmaker, she also thinks Mark is just a storyteller, and it was hard to tell when he was speaking the truth or just making things up. And he often spoke in riddles. For example, he sent her this, which I believe was a text. It said, quote, these are all separate text messages, line by line. I'm not a victim. I was never attacked. I'm not a murderer. Exactly what am I? Tell me what I am. Not an accomplice, not a victim, never attacked. What am I? Jane also considered that Mark reaching out to her was like a way of confessing something. So it's just
Definitely
hard to,
possible.
Yeah, and it's just hard to read this guy. He seems like a complete oddball. And why else? I mean, why would he reach out this extensively too, and then even agreed to be interviewed later on, as we'll see? It's just really confusing.
It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
We, as we'll talk about here in a minute, we know that he met Herb, and we know that they had contact. Because I think one would be like, well, what am I? You're just a liar who's trying to insert himself into this case.
Sure.
But we know, based on documents, that he was in contact with Herb. He went to the same places with Herb. He also knew a lot of the people that Herb was in contact with.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there's a doubt there, but it does seem like such a bizarre thing to say. And why? Just something's not right with this guy either. And it makes me feel like there's some similarities to Herb in that way.
Mm.
And the way that he's sort of making these riddles and just the way that he just talks, really. I mean, everything that comes out of his mouth is seemingly calculated, and you can tell he's processing a million things in his mind all at the same time. So I think Jane could possibly be on the right track. This is sort of his roundabout way of potentially confessing or, alluding to things without actually admitting to anything.
Right.
Because he's smart enough to know that if he says the wrong thing, he's going to, connect himself.
Right.
It's just, you need to watch it to understand even what we're talking about, because it is, I've never seen anything like it before.
No.
In any case, let alone a serial killer case. It's just so bizarre.
Yeah, I agree. I think the closest I've ever gotten, but it was the suspect in the case. It was you ever see The Jinx on HBO?
Oh, yeah.
I think Robert Durst.
Yep, Robert Durst.
Yeah, they actually, well, I don't want to spoil anything, but that's the only time you get to witness this guy firsthand, and you're like, you could just tell he's a villain and something's completely off about him the whole time. And then, yeah, ultimately that documentary, probably one of the best little docuseries I've seen. But that reminded me a lot of this. You're getting kind of just to see the guy himself, which often in documentaries like this, you'll get to see the police officers who invested the case. You get to see some of the families of the victims. But yeah, just to have this guy front and center in an interview is wild. But I mean, this also wasn't the first time, because in February 1997, Mark was actually interviewed by an A&E documentary crew. And it was then he claimed that Herb told him he killed between 50 and 60 people, which had not been mentioned in his interview with police. Eddie Moore, a public information officer from Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, confirmed that they were considering Mark as a suspect at the time, but it's unclear how seriously. And it's apparently Mark had also left town soon after the discoveries at Fox Hollow Farm, which is, I mean, take that as you will.
So one of the big reveals in the docuseries was the entrance of cold case investigator Steve Ainsworth, who's very, very impressive.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed his take on this case. This is a guy who worked as a police officer in Boulder County, actually, here in Colorado for 44 years and was a detective for almost 32 years. And he took an interest in the case in recent years. He has investigated roughly 2,300 deaths in his career with only one unsolved homicide.
That's crazy.
Damn.
Those stats are out of control.
Yeah, that's
You're
crazy.
almost batting 1,000 here.
And he now works on consulting cold cases and unidentified human remains. He's also worked on several high-profile cases over the years, including the infamous John Benet Ramsey case, Betty Lee Jones, and Boulder Jane Doe cases. Jeff Jellison in the docuseries called Steve Ainsworth the Michael Jordan of cold case investigations, which is iconic.
Yeah.
And he knew that he could take a look at this case with a fresh pair of eyes. Steve then reviewed the interview, supplemental reports, crime scene photos, and subsequently the videotapes with Mark Goodyear. And across the board, he's always found one thing in common, that Mark Goodyear's name came up everywhere. In the police file, Steve found a transcript of a phone call between Herb's business attorney, John Egloff, and investigator Todd Urich on July 5th, 1996. And this interview was 2 days after Herb had committed suicide. John said that he had gotten a call from Herb Baumeister on November 29th, 1995. This was the year before the property search when Herb took his life. On the call, John said that Herb was in a panic and said that 5 minutes after he hung up the phone, he wouldn't be around anymore. John interpreted this as Herb planning on taking his own life, although it didn't happen then. Herb mentioned that there was a note for his wife behind a picture of their kids in the den, and he told John not to call Julie until later that evening. Herb then told him that his businesses were failing and he was stressed out about the bankruptcies. So he told John that he had decided that this was the quote-unquote best way out for him and his family. He also admitted to John that he had, quote, gotten involved with Mark Goodyear.
So confirmed.
And then he goes on to say that Mark was a really dangerous guy. He admitted that he once woke up to Mark trying to strangle him and mentioned that Mark had recently been stalking him. He was also worried that Mark would come after his family after he was gone. So that's like another huge piece of this, is that we now have Herb, and again, maybe Herb's just lying and trying to
throw somebody else under
the bus. But Mark Goodyear himself in the docuseries literally says he strangled Herb at one point.
Right, yeah. Because, I mean, Herb was into it, right? So it's
the
a lot of
asphyxiation was the thing that they were into.
So like, when does it become, this is just a sexual thing, and then when does it become real strangulation?
Until Steve finds even more evidence
Yeah.
that makes you question everything.
Mm-hmm.
Herb then mentioned that there was more information on Mark above the lockers in his Save-A-Lot store on the west side, but whatever Herb was referencing to was never found.
Damn.
Which, did Mark know about that and possibly go and remove it? I mean, who knows? This phone call confirmed that Herb had been planning his death long before the property search.
Yep.
So that tells me that it's possible Mark Goodyear may have known about this plan. This also confirmed that police had been warned about Mark Goodyear soon after Herb's suicide in 1996. And in Steve Ainsworth's opinion, there is no question that the phone call was legitimate since Herb's attorney was an officer of the court. I mean, why would he make up this?
Yeah.
In his review of the case, Steve also came across a transcript of an interview at the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office with a man named John Fulham. In 1996, John talked about how he was picked up by an unknown man who took him out to a property he later identified as Fox Hollow. John had stayed the night with the man there on July 4th, 1993. He had met the man at the Metro bar that night around 8 or 9 p.m., and they drove separately back to Fox Hollow Farm. The mysterious man might have driven a dark pickup truck. He then described the property and the house in detail, which matched Fox Hollow Farm. And when officers showed John a picture of Herb, John said that Herb was not the man he was with that night. He recalled the man's name was either Michael or Mark.
Mm-hmm.
This man had claimed that he was house sitting for his boss. All very suspicious.
And that comment makes me think, did Mark have a key to Fox Hollow Farm? Was he just like, what was Herb just giving him kind of like, hey, you can hang out here whenever? Because I think if I remember right, Mark was maybe like living with his grandma, or his housing situation was a bit like transitory. He didn't really have a place for himself. So I wonder how often Mark may have been crashing at Fox Hollow Farm when Julie and the kids were out of the house. If
during when all this is going down.
Yeah, right.
So how the hell did he not know anything?
Yeah.
Makes no sense.
Or be involved.
Or be involved, yeah. John then described the man he was with. He said he was about 6 feet tall, had a slim build, and had no facial hair. He had short hair and was about 25 years old. Steve pointed out that this description sounded a lot like Mark Goodyear, who would have been in his mid-20s at the time. And there's a photo out there of Mark Goodyear around this age, and this description lines up pretty good. Unfortunately, John Fulham passed away before he could be re-interviewed by Jeff or Steve. Steve also reviewed Mark's original interview from June 26, 1996, that police interview. He noted that Mark Goodyear admitted that he had gone to the property of his own volition. He also noticed that something wasn't adding up in Mark's description of the instance of erotic asphyxiation. If you remember, Mark had said, quote, his eyes were bugging out, lips are turning purple, the whole 9 yards. Steve noticed these are not signs of erotic asphyxiation. These are signs of actual strangulation. In the interview, Mark explained that it was done by focusing pressure on the jugular vein, and he admitted that he had done it before and gotten high off of it. In Steve's opinion, it seemed like Mark had been more familiar with this process than he was letting on. He also pointed out that Mark said he could sense that there was something wrong with Herb and that he was scared of him. But he still, despite saying these two things, ended up staying the rest of the night and part of the morning with him.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
Mark also admitted that he then gave Herb his number and invited him over for dinner. How does that line up with being scared of this guy?
Mm-hmm.
Which is odd because not only does he think he's dangerous, but he also suspects that he's a murderer.
Yeah,
and he's talking about seeing heads and bodies, and it's like his story does not add up at all.
Yeah, it's very odd.
Unfortunately, the original detectives did not press this point any further, which is a major failure on their part when this stuff is coming up. And Steve even says, he's like, they should have pressed him on all of these things.
Yeah, we probably could have got some more legitimate information out of him. So Steve Ainsworth also reviewed the footage taken by the paranormal researchers in 2023, when they met Mark at the house. Mark had claimed that he knew Herb owned a firearm and kept it in his downstairs lockers, but then he claimed that he had never seen it. He also admitted to the paranormal researchers that he thought Herb was going to shoot him down there. The lie about not seeing the gun indicates that Mark had been to the house more than one time, and if he knew Herb had a gun but did not see it during the only alleged visit, this meant, he had been to the property multiple times. Makes no sense to be like, yeah, he has a gun. I don't know about it. I've never seen it. He never pulled it out that one time I was at the house. So that kind of confirms that despite what Mark is saying, that doesn't line up exactly. So Steve is saying that would make sense that he was at the house multiple times. Which
is why a proper interrogation should have been done. Because that's the whole point of the interrogation, is to see if the story stays the same.
Catch him in lies.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
Trip him up and then press him on it.
Yeah.
Break, he's just all over the place. And then he infuses it with emotion as well, which is hard to tell if it's genuine or not, to try to mislead you, I feel like.
Yeah.
It's baffling to me.
Yeah. It's also kind of a disgrace that the PI, Virgil, went so far out of his way to find this guy gets him into this police interview, and then the police are kind of like, "Oh, well, thanks for your time. We'll see you
And that's
later."
literally how it went.
Yeah.
They're like, thanks for coming in. Thanks for your
Telling
info.
your
Have a
story.
nice day, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, missed opportunities left and right in that initial investigation. And in the paranormal investigation interview, Mark also admitted to seeing a mannequin or dead body inside one of the rooms of the house, and he had not mentioned any of this to police in that initial investigation. Steve also pointed out that while he gave the paranormal researchers a tour, he wasn't wearing any shoes. This was a weird observation, but they kind of bring it up again later in that docuseries that he popped off his shoes again when he was getting interviewed. He appeared really relaxed in the house, and Mark also brought up his newfound belief in God. If you watch the docuseries, you can kind of hear him talking about that. He believed there was this angel and his God standing there with him inside the house. So Steve thought that Mark had possibly taken off his shoes because he felt like he was maybe on sacred ground. And in Exodus 3:5, he kind of quotes this one. God tells Moses, quote, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." I think we kind of understand that theory of taking off your shoes in a place that's kind of respected. So even Jeff Jellison agreed with Steve Ainsworth that Mark seemed to have some sort of affection or reverence towards the Fox Hollow Farm property. I found that really odd because it could go alongside this theory that Mark, we've already said, he said he's like, I don't see Herb as this monster anymore. He's like, I can't accept that he was a bad person. So if you're reading that far into it, that he sees that property as like this special place to him, I don't know. I'm trying to piece together my thoughts on that one, but
it's hard to come up with a rational thought around it.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that comes to my mind is he says these things along the lines of, why me? Why didn't he kill me?
Yeah.
And so maybe it's this, now that he's religious, it's this sort of out of respect for God, because he literally says like God and angel are here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Out of respect for God saving his life. But then he says some weird things of like, that sound along the lines of wishing that Herb had killed him.
Right.
It's just like,
he's
constantly contradicting himself.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's just who this guy is and that's just how he always is.
Yeah.
Or he's doing this deliberately, or I don't know. It's really hard to understand anything that he's saying, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
But I think that's a great observation by Steve. I mean,
yeah. And Steve isn't just, I like how Steve doesn't go off of just what Mark is saying. He goes on like, what's the actual factual? He tries to pinpoint something that's actually happening. He kind of knows how to sift through Mark's confusing puzzles that he tries to get out there. And he's like, we can identify he took off his shoes. So why? Or he brought up this gun, and he tries to piece in the facts to what is behind Mark's, like, he talks like the Riddler sometimes.
Yeah, he does.
Like, I don't know what you're saying, but Steve's good at kind of surpassing the riddles and getting.
Yeah, he's clearly got a lot of experience dealing with people like that.
Yeah, definitely. But they also agreed, Jeff and Steve also agreed that since Mark had admitted to lying in the original investigation, he was probably still lying. So it was hard to tell what was the truth during these interviews, but ultimately Steve believed that Mark was probably involved in the crimes with Herb Baumeister. And I mean, Steve, I have no reason to not believe that guy. At one point, Mark claimed that he was not involved in the crimes and even specifically mentioned that he did not lure or attract anybody to the property. So Steve found it odd that, why would he even mention something that specific? In 2025 ABC News Studios docuseries that we've been talking about, the Fox Hollow Murders, Mark Goodyear was interviewed again, and he was hoping this would be the last time. And throughout much of the interview, he avoided questions or didn't respond with logical answers, probably as he often does throughout.
And he alludes to knowing so much more.
Yeah.
He like teases you.
Yeah.
It's like, that's for another day or another start. And it's like, so So it's hard not to think this guy's just full of shit, and
Yeah.
why are we even wasting our time with this guy? But then you go back to the pieces that Steve found, and you're like, but Herb himself is telling his attorney about Mark Goodyear.
How dangerous he is. Yeah.
It's hard to ignore that.
Yeah, it is. So Mark claimed that, if you believe him, he met Herb at a club called 501. Herb had been looking at the wall of missing persons posters, so Mark went up and made conversation, saying that he wanted to know what happened to his friend Roger Allen Goodlett. Mark eventually got Herb outside, and he got into his car, and both men then went to Fox Hollow.
Which this is interesting too, because he adds in this little tidbit of detail that he pushes Herb.
Oh yeah, outside. Yeah,
he pushes him into like the back alley of the bars, and this alley connects all the bars.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of implicates himself as almost like he's got this aggressive, nature to him.
Right.
Like he like took control of her.
Right.
Which I thought was kind of
really
interesting.
Weird, yeah. Maybe Mark just has a flair for the dramatic. Maybe he's just like trying to spice up a story left and right.
I think when you look at it without knowing some of the other things, I think it's easy. I think 9 out of 10 people will be like, yeah, this guy's just a
full of shit,
drama queen, and wants attention, and is just trying to. He likes this like mystery of like, oh, you don't know what whether I'm telling the truth or not, and I'm in control. He likes to be in control of the situation.
Yep. As you can definitely see in those interviews. And I think he just likes the attention too. That's what I kind of read from him. I'm like, I think he likes being on camera, and I think he likes being weird and mysterious, and I don't know, but
maybe he is just weird.
Maybe he's just a weird guy.
I mean, maybe he's dealing with some of the same mental issues too. That Herb had. I mean, who knows?
Right. There could be a lot going on there. So according to Mark, Herb had done cocaine that night, and he started talking about strangulation and how silk was as strong as steel. Unlike what Mark told police in the first interview, he now claimed that he could see burning human bodies outside. Later in the night, Mark drugged Herb's drink. He claimed that Herb, after being knocked out for 40 minutes, he enjoyed it. He then claimed they went to the pool area, which was so foggy you could barely see her hands. Then they played some of Herb's games where he talked about strangulation and wanted Mark to repeat what he said. He said things like, quote, I really like to see the eyes bulging out. I like to see the tongue bulging out, the lips swelling and turning purple and then cracking. Mark then claimed that Herb later insinuated that he had killed 56 people.
Which they pressed him on that, and they're like, well, not directly type of thing. And you're like, what are
you talking about?
That's a very direct number. What are you talking?
He's like, he insinuated it.
Yes.
In so many words. And it's like, what is it?
But it's 56.
Yeah, exactly. What? How do you insinuate a number? I don't really understand that. But when asked about Herb's videos, Mark claimed Herb had shown him some of those disturbing videos, but he couldn't really tell what was going on in them. And I mean, much like everything else with Mark, everything's so obscure, right? And then apparently when Mark watched these, he would scream at the tapes and Herb would grab his tongue. And in Mark's words, Herb was, quote, clinically insane. When he asked if he had a romantic relationship with Herb, he declined to answer, which we already no, he's already said yes in the past.
Clearly he had a romantic relationship with him.
But then he's trying to be like,
walk it back. Yeah.
Cloudy and
Do
mysterious.
you really know or not?
Yeah. So odd. Then he said that Herb had stalked him, and when he left after that first night, he said he had given Herb his grandmother's address, which I think where he was crashing at that time, and he would show up there every once in a while. And then Mark admitted to stalking Herb through downtown alleyways and into bars, where he would then tell everyone that Herb was a killer and to not go home with him.
Which he, his version of it is, I would get on top of the furniture and the countertops, and I would scream the shrill scream of, don't go home with him. He's a killer.
Yeah. It's the drama.
Yeah.
It's like you're watching a stage play or something.
And then he literally acted out Herb's response. He'd be like, nobody will believe you. Like literally he's
acting. Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah.
God, Mark is, he's such a conundrum.
Yeah. Yeah. he knows how to be entertaining, which is odd. And I think maybe he's playing into that because he's like, ooh, the cameras are here. Kind of like action.
It's like
and he gets into this weird character.
But is he involved?
I don't know. It's hard to tell. I think he likes to keep it obscure, though. But I mean, if we just stick with Steve's opinion on it, if he said he probably thinks he was involved with the crimes, I'm going to go with that. And Steve seems like he can kind of read through the BS and the theatrics that are on display. But Mark defended himself, saying that he was constantly on the phone with police.
Yeah, which I don't think anybody believed that.
Yeah. He said sometimes 6 to 7 times a day.
Yeah, and he fucking said Herb was in the room.
Yeah.
I'm like, dude, get out of here, bro.
Yeah.
That did not happen.
That's ridiculous. Apparently, he said the police just ignored him. And then
or it did happen. They're like, oh, God
this
damn
guy
it, not
again?
this guy.
Yeah.
The Riddler's back.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah, seriously. And Herb's harassment, according to Mark, went on for 2 years. When the police searched the Fox Hollow Farm property in 1996, where they found all the bones, Mark claimed that Herb was watching the news report on his sofa. And apparently he had a gun with him. And Mark thought Herb was going to kill him, but he didn't. And Mark also did not believe that Herb took his own life. I think with the thing on his sofa,
wasn't Herb up with Eric?
He was with his son. So I'm like, he's making stuff up.
He clearly is. But is it out of just like he's nutty and he just wants attention? Or is it because he's trying to put as much blame on Herb as possible to cover his own involvement?
Sure.
And that's the tough part of it.
Yeah.
Because it's so dramatized that you're like,
what's real here? Yeah.
And maybe that's the strategy.
I think the confusion
it makes him look
is a part
so
of it.
loony that you're just like, there's no way this guy's out of his mind.
Yeah.
But that could be like completely
chess
calculated.
play. Yeah.
He's just working it.
For sure.
And working us all over.
Yeah.
In his review of the case file, Steve Ainsworth came across a damning interview with a man named Leroy Bray, who he described as, quote, player off and on in the downtown gay community, and he had briefly dated Herb in the 90s. His interview added another incident involving Mark Goodyear. The following is what Leroy stated during his interview with police in February of 1997. He had visited Fox Hollow for a surprise party of some kind. He described the property in great detail, which indicated to police that he had, in fact, been on the property. While there, Leroy was persuaded to drink a whiskey and Coke, although he was trying to not drink at first. He soon felt off and assumed someone had laced the drink. He was then asked to step outside. He thought they were having some sort of barbecue, and while outside, he was introduced to a few others, including Mark Goodyear. So here's Mark Goodyear's name coming up again.
Mm-hmm.
When he asked about what was going on, the others said that they were going to perform some theatrical stuff. A bit later, a man then came out in a large raincoat and a hat, and he wore a mask over his face. 2 men then also appeared in the backyard. Leroy identified one of them as Mark Goodyear. The other man he didn't know. The man he didn't know asked the guy in the raincoat, quote, "Hey, what's going on, baby?" The raincoat man said, "Hey, he's what's going on." The raincoat man then took out a pistol and shot the man 2 to 3 times. Then he took a shotgun out and shot the man again. Then the man in the coat pointed the shotgun at Leroy. He gave the shotgun over to someone else as he took off his raincoat and mask, revealing himself to be Herb Baumeister. And he said, "Surprise!" Then Leroy took off running and eventually escaped the property. When the detective asked Leroy if anyone else saw this or if anyone else participated in the shooting, he confirmed there were others who witnessed this incident. He verbally identified Mark Goodyear as one of them, and he clarified that Mark had held the victim's arms during the shooting, which would have made him an accomplice. Handcuffs were also used on the victim, and this was never followed up on by investigators. And that interview is the only one that mentioned this event. So it seems like investigators are just like, that sounds like a bunch of BS.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to look into that one. And that's basically what Mark Goodyear says, because the producers ask him about this event. And he's like, and he kind of just like diverts too. He's like, kind of making you question Leroy and like, was it the same Leroy?
Because he confirmed that he did know.
He did know Leroy.
Yeah.
Yep.
But then when they were talking about this situation, he was like, he had no idea apparently what this was about.
And unfortunately, Leroy Bray is now deceased, so Steve couldn't interview him. Also, in the docuseries, Mark was asked if he knew Leroy. He said Leroy had invited him to a party to sell his candles, and Mark's spouse had also known Leroy. When confronted about Leroy's statement to police back in 97, Mark denied he had ever witnessed anything like that at Fox Hollow, so basically an execution. He also went on to claim that Leroy had limited mental capacity and that he was attention-seeking, which there's no way to confirm either of those things.
No.
And sounds like a diversion to me. According to Steve, Leroy had no reason to lie in his interview with police, and there were other indications that Leroy was overly honest. He'd even admitted to working as a prostitute and didn't tell sexual partners that he was HIV positive. Steve did acknowledge that Leroy could have seen news coverage of the case and manufactured a story, but he also didn't think he had the capacity to weave such an intricate, detailed story. And just to be clear and cover our asses, Mark Goodyear has not been charged with or convicted of any crimes connected to this case. But the case of Herb Baumeister and Fox Hollow Farm remains open. It's really, really tough to... I don't know that we'll ever know the full truth unless they can find a way to connect Mark to Herb's crimes in some way,
right,
and then press him and really interrogate him. But even then, I don't know if they would even be able to get anywhere with him.
Right. I think the general idea is if they can identify more of the victims through DNA, then it might lead them to people who are still alive that can kind of piece together Mark's involvement. But then again, all you would have is just more interviews, and it's hard to... I think physical evidence is a big...
How are you going to prove that they were involved in the murder?
Yeah.
At this point, I mean, it's been so many years and all that. I mean, it seems like Herb took most of the damning evidence with him and destroyed it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. But just last year, Steve and Jeff set up 2 canine cadaver dogs at the property to find any more human remains, and 3 more potential remains were discovered. Although there might be much more to the case, and luckily DNA testing provided by the local government might lead to more victims being identified. And as of 2024, 4 DNA profiles have been pulled from the remains that have not yet been matched to a person. Cheek swab DNA samples can provide valuable information for identifying the remaining victims. Jeff Jellison asked families with male loved ones who went missing from the mid-1980s to early 1990s to contact the Hamilton County Coroner's Office at 317-770-4415 so that they can arrange that DNA swab to hopefully try to figure out whose remains these are.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of work. It's awesome to see that there's new progress being made, though, because you never know. I mean, who knows if one of these names pops up and they start looking into how they became involved with Herb, and that there might be some other, smoking gun, so to speak,
right,
discovered, that could possibly either just clear up, this whole accomplice thing, but also could potentially point to the accomplice, if there was one.
And obviously that's like best case scenario, but even at its worst, you're still identifying a victim and allowing families to get closure, right?
Yeah, and that's really what it's all about at the end of the day. Is there's still countless loved ones who don't know what happened.
Yeah,
to their dad, their brother, their son, and so that's ultimately what the whole purpose of this is at the end of the day.
Right.
And if it provides more clues and further information around the investigation of Herb Baumeister, I think that's just a bonus at this point.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think we've gone over all of our thoughts and feelings about who else was possibly involved. Maybe there is somebody out there who hasn't been named that was involved. Maybe there was more than one. I mean, that's also a possibility that Steve talked about.
True.
But I think when Herb took his own life, I think a lot of those secrets went with him.
Yeah, I agree.
And so there's just some things that we'll never truly know. And I wonder how Herb's wife and kids are doing. I hope they've been able to. Very difficult to move on from. Couldn't even imagine how you'd move on from this type of situation.
Yeah. I know she was involved in some interviews after all this happened, I think she was only interviewed on camera one time, and I think it might have been the A&E documentary. But I don't know, people have also accused her of like being a little shifty about what she knew and how she portrayed her marriage after the fact. But yeah, man, I couldn't even imagine.
Well, one good point of good thing that really came out of this series and everything is that on August 29th, 2024, a memorial was installed to honor the memories of the 9 confirmed victims of Fox Hollow Farm. Space has been left to add more names if and when more are identified. And the ossuary will be a free burial option where loved ones can lay the victims to rest, which is awesome. That there's something like this now. But that is the Fox Hollow Farm murders. I want to leave you here with some words from Jeff Jellison himself, because I think it really helps just understand who he is and his motive behind being, getting this reopened. And really, it's become a personal mission for him, I think, at this point, which kudos to him.
Yeah, that's a great legacy to leave behind.
Totally. Wish more coroners had this this attitude.
Yeah.
But I'll leave you with some words from him, and then there is a few pictures of the victims, and we'll put their names up on the screen for you. But yeah, that's going to be it for us today. Definitely let us know your thoughts below on Herb and especially Mark Goodyear, and definitely go check out the Hulu docuseries.
Yeah.
Really, really well done, and again, it'll just add so much more perspective to this episode. Especially in our conversations around Mark Goodyear.
I agree.
But we'll have all that linked below, and we'll see you guys next time.
These remains represent people. They're someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother, and these people have been placed on a shelf for 26 years. They were essentially forgotten, and they're not forgotten any longer.